have in real time so that those of you who are watching in real time can ask questions. And you can do that two ways. One is through the question function, the comment function in YouTube, which I hope you're watching right now. And the other is through Twitter using the hashtag COF57 for Circle of Fellows. 4 esteemed fellows with us today, including one of the 2020 class of fellows. Just absolutely delighted, Diane, to have you here with us. You'll be celebrated virtually this year at the IABC conference next month. But let's go around and have everybody introduce themselves, starting with Priya.
Hello, I'm Priya Bates, and I'm here from Toronto, Canada, which is very sunny right now. I run an internal communication agency called Inner Strength Communication, and we focus on internal communication, employee engagement, and change management. I'm looking forward to this discussion today.
Outstanding. Angela, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Angela Sinickas. I also run my own agency, but I focus just on research and measurement for communication. Although in the past, my background is not statistics. I am a corporate communicator with a degree in journalism, done all the different jobs that we can do. So glad to be here for this conversation. Some of my pet peeves will be covered.
Diane, you're up now.
Hi, everybody. There's a newbie here. Thank you for inviting me. I am in my last month of an 11-year gig being the Dean of the Park School of Communications at Ithaca College. I am happily stepping back to faculty after that, where I hold an appointment as a professor of strategic communication. And I practice what I preach through my firm, Gayeski Analytics.
And Stacy, you're up last, but not least.
Thanks, Shel. I'm Stacy Wilson. I'm out of Denver, and my firm, Eloquor Consulting, focuses on employee communication with a particular emphasis around intranet and digital workplace.
And I probably should mention that I'm Shel Holtz. I am Director of Internal Communications at Webcor, a commercial builder in California, headquartered in San Francisco. Also a fellow, along with the 4 fellows joining us today. Our topic is integrated communications, which, as I've done a little bit of research, of course, you know, this is a concept that we're all very familiar with, but just in preparation for today, I wanted to see what was out there. And I see it defined all kinds of different ways. And I opted not to choose one. So let's start with that. What do you think this really means when people talk about integrated communications? Or better, what should it mean?
For me, it's choosing the right combination of channels based on the right topic, so that you are using the fewest possible channels to get the most people, so you're not overwhelming them. It's finding that right balance. I think there's next month's topic, we'll talk about how to integrate internal versus external, the functions. So I think I'm looking at it more from the perspective of integrating the channels we're using for a particular audience.
I would agree with that, Angela, and I would add that it's important to integrate the technology side in a way that enables really good strategic decision making about what technologies to use and how to use them. And because that gets kind of divided out between IT and other parts of the organization, frequently that makes it particularly difficult for organizations to be successful in integrating those elements.
I think it's also about how we use communication to solve business problems, and that's getting the right channel, the right subject, but it's also about our power in influencing the communications within our organization and the communication of our customers as well. So it's not about us doing everything, but choosing the right ways to get us to that end result from a business perspective.
And Diane, how is this approached in the academic world?
Yeah, good question. So we have a degree called Integrated Marketing Communications, and that's the integration of advertising, PR, and marketing. We also have another major that focuses more on internal communication, and that looks not only at employee communication, but also training And that's one area that I find is often neglected or left out of the conversation when we talk about communications. Um, in my experience, not only as an educator, but even more so as a consultant, I found that internal and external communications will sometimes get on the same page and talk about business problems and addressing them with particular messages or strategies. I find that folks in HR and training are often left out of that. And so I would argue that every form of communication that goes out from an organization, that voice of the organization, whether it goes out in terms of philanthropy or training to employees or HR or public relations, all needs to be integrated in some way.
When I was at Allergan as manager of internal communications, I found that there were external communications going out. Would have been really nice if employees had known they were coming, but we didn't know about it. So I started a weekly roundtable with everybody doing any communication in the organization, just so we knew what everybody was up to so that we could plan to coordinate. Does that sort of fit that definition, Diane?
I think so. What I have found, I'll give you an example. One of my clients was a large bank that had spent millions on a rebranding initiative. The bank had been known for being very technically sharp, but not having a very warm and fuzzy kind of touch. And so that the whole brand repositioning was trying to position the bank as being a place that valued relationships. And so I saw a great deal of alignment in terms of the external communication. But then, in fact, I was working on training for the tellers, and all of the measures that were being imposed on the tellers and all the training was all about efficiency and accuracy and about, like, don't let people stand in line and make sure that you minimize the time that you're talking to people. It was exactly opposite of the branding message. And so, I think the hard part for this was a very large international bank. People in internal communications and marketing didn't even know who to contact in training. They had never met those people. They didn't even know sort of how to find them in the directory. So, my whole purpose, as I said, is sort of my engagement as a consultant was being like the social director on a cruise ship. And I was basically just inviting people to lunch and saying, hello, director of training, please meet the director of internal communications.
Yes, that's interesting. I've worked a lot with people in training. In fact, just this week, I wrapped up actually producing an online training course about all of the protocols for returning to the office. Worked with the director of learning and development. This is mounted now on our learning management system. And I never once thought of that as an integrated communications, but I suppose it is. Has anybody else had experience working with departments that are not traditional communication functions in that way?
When I was inside Canada's largest grocer, we always had task force. It was the way that we ran any project. So here's what we were trying to do as a business. Now, who needed to be at the table? And it would be different based on what the project was, but we did have everyone who needed to be there around the table. And sometimes it was IT, which you wouldn't think you needed to include in a reorg communication, and PR, because you need to think of what those impacts were externally. Sometimes it was operations, because you really needed them to understand how managers were going to speak to their employees. And so it was really the question always started with who needs to be at the table so that we can create something consistent.
We did that when we were initiating a new mission, vision, and values for 4 different entities that we had acquired in pieces and then we're pulling together. So what we had to do was not just the communication campaign to say, here's what it is, but we had to work with all the different people who did things from recruitment advertising to recruitment interviewing to promotional practices to recognition programs, even the exiting process, so that every single system, every single form, every process that we had was consistent with that. Otherwise, talking about it is just talking. It's not actually happening.
And Shel, I would add one other group that hasn't been mentioned yet that I find frequently is very important, and that is legal. Whether it's legal or compliance, maybe both of them if they're separate teams. But frequently with communication initiatives, we need to get those folks on board early so they're not pushing back on some of the things that we're trying to do, and they really understand strategically why we're making the recommendations that we need to make.
So who's in charge when you're working in this manner? You have different functions. Each of them has a different charter and a different mandate and a different reporting structure, but you're all trying to achieve at some level some common goals. So who leads an effort like this?
None of us want to speak first, right? We're all...
Well, it would depend on what the project was. I mean, we had very specific structures. So there was always an executive sponsor who sat on the management team. And it would be someone different based on what the project was. And that person would be required to be the last decision maker. And then you'd have a program manager and then who was at the table. It was the same structure and the same process, but different people depending on the program, which was always very exciting to get to know people throughout the organization and learn who's who.
Sometimes that's the first question, Shel, is who actually needs to lead the effort. That's not necessarily intuitive. I'll give you some examples. I've been frequently in situations where IT technically owns a budget for something that we're trying to accomplish, but that's just because they have to make the licensing purchase. And they probably should not be responsible in leading relative to strategic decision making. So sometimes in those situations, you have to ask that question and talk about, who is the best executive sponsor and where really should this sit, regardless of where the budget lives.
One of the things that I have found to be a challenge is who is the business analyst who decides what the performance gap is and what the best intervention is. What I found in a lot of organizations is the sponsor will come up with some idea of what they think is the best solution. So they immediately go to a PR campaign or an incentive campaign or a training campaign. And they'll immediately start engaging either internal or external partners in that. And often those partners are feel like they need to do what's asked of them so that they're responsive. And frankly, they also don't want to lose the business. But that client or sponsor often is not in a good position to have diagnosed what the real problem is. And they just sort of jump at a solution. And the big problem that I've seen, and one of the things that we explore in academia, is how do we prepare the next generation of people who can be that sort of corporate diagnostician and the solution agnostic, right? So that they don't have any incentive to say, well, let's spend the $500,000 on training or on rebranding or an incentive system. Rather, they are just sort of the unbiased diagnostician, and then the project gets doled out to the right set and hopefully an integrated set of a team who can respond to that. Now, sometimes I've been brought in as the external consultant who can do that because I don't have any relationship to the internal parties and don't know the vendors. And I just come in and diagnose the solution and just kind of say, okay, here's the problem. Here's what I think you need as this set of interventions. But I think that's often the missing piece and why sometimes business problems aren't solved and communicators get blamed. Like, oh, we spent all this money on this campaign and things never changed. Well, yeah, because there was a missing piece there somehow.
It sounds like there's really two approaches to this. One is a project approach, which I think requires us to think of this as an ad hoc type of a committee, where you come up with the committee's goals and objectives, leaving the departmental goals and objectives behind, identifying the right person to lead, and disbanding when the project is over. But we hear a lot about integrated communication or integrated marketing systems, which is something else altogether. That's just making sure that you're touching all of the right audiences through all of the right channels ongoing. How have you seen that work?
Yeah, Shel, if I could answer that, I've done a lot of work over the last 25 years with organizations to help them understand that broader system. And initially what we try to do is bring together who we think are the right people to develop that long-term approach. And then oftentimes that team that we expect to provide that ongoing direction and leadership changes a little bit, because in the process of developing the strategy and the guidelines and so on around that system, we might identify that there are some people that we tapped early on who really don't need to continue to be involved, but then there may be others that we didn't think to include who very much do need to be involved. So we, in the process of developing the strategy and processes, we figure out who are the right folks for that ongoing team that will shepherd long-term what that system needs to look like and how it needs to behave.
I think there's something else too, because as you said, people may change. They come and go for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it helps if they have a blueprint or a Bible or a cookbook that they're all working from. And from that, you get that from doing some baseline research, and you probably have to repeat it every year or so. So what you would do is you'd find out what is it that people actually know currently about all these key topics you do communicate on an ongoing basis, strategy, benefits, whatever those topics are, so that you know on each topic, is there an interest problem? Are people simply not interested in it that you need to beef up the interest? Are they not informed enough, or are they already over-informed? But then the key thing is, where do they currently learn about each of these topics separately, and where would they prefer to? Because I think what happens otherwise, you get all these committees or task forces, and they tackle each problem as if it's the first time they've ever seen it, and they're trying to come up with the right mix of channels for the campaign. And they're guessing. So if you do the research with the audience, you're going to know on which topics do they want to read about it, or do they want to talk about it, or some combination. If they want to read about it, is this something they want pushed to them through an email or a newsletter, or is this something that they're happy to read whenever time allows on the internet or through some kind of social channel? So if you find out for each topic what that right approach is, when you come up with some new initiative that's similar to one of them, it already tells you that best combination of channels, regardless of which people are on that project. And you can turn it sort of sideways, and you can say, well, now here's what we've learned for each of these topics, but we've also learned for each channel, what are the right topics to use for each channel? If we're doing leadership meetings with employees, what are the topics they want to hear about from senior management versus what are the topics they want to talk about in team meetings, versus if you're doing a newsletter, what are the topics we need to cover there versus what's on the internet? So if you have that as a basis, then it doesn't matter which groups of people are coming together at different times. They're starting literally from the same page and moving on from there.
I'd like to think also that whatever programs, the sub-programs that exist in an organization are connected in some larger way to a greater strategy and long-term strategy for the organization. You know, I think right now in terms of what we're dealing with those organizations that have business continuity teams that are long-term. They have processes, they've got governance, they've got members who come in and out depending on what's required, but they've got a way of delivering that they can come together in a crisis, but they've got ongoing processes and checkpoints that are part of how they function. And those companies that have those business continuity processes and planning in place are probably on automatic now versus trying to make things up as they go along.
Right. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I have an interesting situation that I'm monitoring. My cousin, who's also in the field, just hired at a company about 9 months ago to be the chief marketing officer. And they're primarily, I would say, an e-commerce company, business to consumer. And he's digging in and asking a lot of questions about the integration of systems, both IT systems and marketing and communicating out to employees especially the people who are the customer service representatives who talk to customers either online or on the phone. There's been a it's kind of disintegration of that process, and he's actually going to be moving into the COO role, and it's going to be interesting to see where companies are finding themselves, especially in these days that are mostly virtual now companies, that everything is communications. Will there be something like could almost be the chief communication officer is the COO and organizes communications from that seat, or it might be a chief communication officer who has a set of protocols, as others are mentioning, kind of this idea of playbooks or standing committees. So, I actually think that in these days, in the last couple of months, the nature of business has changed. And because communications has been done in this virtual environment and everybody's focusing more intentionally on what's happening, I think we might see different roles for communicators.
We've been talking a lot about governance. I'd like to talk a little bit about tactics, and we can always come back to governance. But before we get into that, I do want to remind people who are watching live that you are welcome to submit questions and comments. You can do that using the chat function right there in YouTube or via Twitter with the hashtag COF57. Happy to take your questions. I think the integrated marketing campaign that I read about that was described in most detail in some article somewhere, because this was a few years ago, was the 100th anniversary of the Oreo cookie. I don't know if you heard about this campaign. It was remarkable. What they did was they came up with an image for each of the days leading up to the actual anniversary. So, for example, they were all, images of the cookie, but manipulated to accommodate this theme. And if it happened to fall on some date where something happened in history or some holiday, they had one prepared. So, for example, the day that Neil Armstrong first set foot on the moon, they had the cookie opened up, the white cream in the middle, and the boot print on it. For the Pride celebration, they had rainbow stripes on the cream. And then what they would do is if there was breaking news, they would scrap the one they had planned for that day and really quickly come up with one. So the day that the referees in the National Football League came back from a strike, they had one where they sliced the outside cake, right, the shell. So you had black and white stripes, like the referee shirt, jersey. So they had these images going out on social media. They had employee ambassadors helping get those out. They were on Tumblr, so and several other social channels, Facebook and the like, Instagram. So they had their social media team involved. They were using advertising for this. They were buying banner ads across all different kinds of online properties. So advertising was involved. And there were so many moving pieces. It culminated on the day of the anniversary with a pop-up shop where members of the various teams were there taking recommendations for what the final image should be from the public. And in Times Square, people could stand around this pop-up shop and watch the team come up with the image and deploy it. There are a lot of moving parts in that and a lot of different platforms. Who would it be in charge of figuring out what all of the appropriate platforms are across marketing and publicity and PR and internal comms in order to get all of these things to work like the well-oiled machine this particular case was? Well, next question.
Nobody's answering.
How would you recommend it if you were counseling?
Obviously, Shel, that's got to be a collaborative effort. I mean, that can't be just one person saying this is how it's going to be.
But you do need a strategist, whoever's in charge of the strategy for the initiative.
Right. And you know, it's hard to say exactly. Each organization is a little bit different in terms of who might be positioned as that strategic driver. But in terms of getting it into home plate, you know, it's got to be a collaborative effort.
And I love those. I love those meetings, right? When you're part of that table where everybody's voice is heard and you collectively come up and here's what I'd like to add to this, and this is what we need to make sure we focus on, and this is what the legal stepping in and saying, maybe not, right? It's always a great collaborative effort where people are voicing their opinions, providing their contributions, and then somebody finally selecting which one of these are we going to go with and which ones are we going to leave.
Priya, that's why I think that the actual most important role here is the facilitator. And I think that's such an important role for the communications professional to take on. It's a skill that we don't generally teach in college curriculum. But facilitation is absolutely vital because we need to be the ones to help facilitate all that conversation that Priya is talking about.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for a lot of these big events, what I've seen is that companies will use an outside vendor, you know, somebody who does experiential or events and kind of coordinates things. And then somehow internal committees are formed for that one-off. But I can't agree with all of you more strongly that yes, we need to teach facilitation skills, and we need to have that kind of collaboration happen more frequently, not just for some big celebration and a kind of a one-off where, you know, people get very energized over something and it's a cute idea, or, you know, similar things happen when there's some incredible crisis. Where I see things have happened more in a more integrated way at our college is either if there was a big celebration, we had the 125th anniversary, so there was a huge celebration around that and an installation of a new president, and there was a lot of coordination. And then when we had great crisis, there's been a lot of coordination. In the everyday, you know, kind of run a business, there isn't, and there's a lot of performance issues that happen. Like, so these big celebrations come off, but the day-to-day performance targets are continuing to be not met very well because there's not an ongoing structure.
In the 100 Days of Oreo campaign, one of the things that impressed me was that each channel was being used based on its strengths. So it was the same image that they were deploying every day, but what they did with it on Tumblr and what they did with it on Twitter were two entirely different things. What I see a lot of in what some people might call integrated campaigns, simply because they're using all the different channels that reach different audiences, is exactly the same thing being deployed across every channel. How do you avoid that? I mean, it seems to me that if you're going to be using a channel, you should be using it, you know, repurposing your content to take advantage of what people love about that particular channel.
Now you've hit on one of my pet peeves. It's that redundancy rather than integration. And so we've got to look at a couple different things. Part of our communication is to increase knowledge about something. And there are some channels that are good at that. But even so, let's say if you send an email or a very timely newsletter, it can alert people about some key deadline that's part of that knowledge. But all that depth of information would reside better perhaps on an intranet. But then if you're wanting to change people's attitudes, writing about it doesn't begin to affect attitudes. And that's where you need to get into the face-to-face channels to discuss these things after it's come out, or social media. And I think a lot of times they're not using social media correctly. They're using it as if it's a bulletin board just to post information, rather than facilitating that conversation of, okay, we sent you an email about this urgent thing. You read all the information on the internet with the background. Now let's talk about what the challenges are or what we need to be considering. And so we need to look about knowledge, attitudes, and then that activation to behavior. Which channel is best for different elements of that messaging, and make sure they fit together and they reference each other, but it's not the exact same thing on every channel.
And that's what happens, Angela, too, when you have the outcome conversation versus the output, right? It's that when we're saying, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish? Then what are the tools what are the messages and the tools we need to use in order to drive that outcome? And that's different based on which channels you're using. So it
And
really is a different conversation. Sorry.
No, sorry. Are you done, Priya?
Yes.
So this gets at one of my pet peeves, and that is about content development and needing to recognize the differences in how to go about developing content for those different channels, because people consume the content differently in different channels. And we tend to craft a piece of content and then we put it everywhere. And we don't think about how people are going to consume differently in different spaces. And we need to really pretty dramatically change the content to facilitate that consumption. And that is a huge pet peeve of mine. We just need to do a better job of that. And we need to Diane, you know, in the college curriculum, we need to teach people how to do that.
Well, and yeah, you know, what I find is that young people are often the primary consumers of especially some of these new channels, primary users in these social media channels. And people who have been trained more traditionally are not themselves users, so they don't know what the style should be for these various channels. So I know that a lot of our students get hired even as interns exactly for some topics like this or projects like this, where companies want to use these social media channels, and they know they're just not kind of hip to it. They know that they don't know how to do things in that style.
And ultimately, it comes down to investment, doesn't it? Like when somebody's trying to do a one-size-fits-all approach, it's because it's easy. It's this is how much time and this is how much money I have in order to invest in that approach. So it's easier to take the one thing versus think of the different approaches, because that requires investment of time and resources.
Mm-hmm.
Which moves on to yet another pet peeve that's related to that, is that a lot of times as communicators, we get frustrated with our executives who need our help, and they say, I need you to send out an email, I need you to do a video, I need you to do, and they focus on that solution, just as Diane mentioned in the beginning. But what I'm seeing on an increasing basis is communicators doing something very, very similar. And it really frustrates me, because here's what I hear them saying. Well, you know, the internet's been around forever and we should probably kill it and just put everything on social media. Or, you know, these emails are just annoying and let's just put it all on the internet or social media. So what's happening is, first, they want to jump to new channels because they're cool and they're fun. They're the latest shiny object. I think you're the first person I ever heard say that, Shel, like 40 years ago. But the other thing is it's convenience. Like a lot of the reasons that people don't do print publications anymore is because it's inconvenient for the communicators to do it, even though all the research, public, private, external, internal, shows that it's more effective. People remember more of it. They're more likely to read more of it, but it's inconvenient. And I've heard communicators say often, too often, that I don't even want to think about it. It's like every conversation, you know, we just have to wean them away from expecting this in a newsletter. Because again, newsletters, even online ones, take too much effort. They should just read it on the internet. We have to train them to just go to the internet. Well, that's stupid, because it's not going to happen. If they don't want to go to the internet for certain information, they won't. And that means they're not going to see it. I'm sorry, I'll stop yelling.
That's okay. I should tell you that we did an internal communications audit when I first started where I work now. And the use of the internet was not great, and the perception of it wasn't. And based on the other results of the survey, we implemented a strategy for the internet. And we just wrapped up our more recent survey, and the use of the internet and the reliance on it and the trust in the quality of the information has just skyrocketed. So, I mean, if you have a product that's not great, it is possible to improve the product to bring people on board. But Angela, to your point, I had a client when I was self-employed, where we did the research and found that print was the ideal solution in this situation. And the person I was working with said that her boss simply wasn't going to allow it. Mm-hmm. And I said, why? Thinking that I could convince this person that this is the right channel. And she says she thinks that print is bad for the environment with the chemicals that are leached. And she's just refusing to do any print because it's bad for the environment. There was no prayer that we were going to
But there is an argument to that. There's an absolute argument to that. Think about this. U-Haul did this. They went from their printed magazine for employees to an online only. And they, even though a lot of people didn't even have online access, nevertheless, what they checked was their online usage. They checked how many people were printing out that magazine at work. Mm-hmm. Because when you have a long publication, you're not going to read it all in one sitting. And people do like to read it when they commute or fly or whatever. So what they did is they counted out how many pieces of paper that was. And they also figured out how much ink that took of ink cartridges. And they found out that the cost just of the smaller percentage of people printing the whole thing out cost them more than mass printing that publication for all employees and distributing it. And now here's the environmental impact. The paper in our copiers is not recycled paper like the magazine paper is. When we were printing magazines, we printed on recycled paper using soy-based ink. Let me tell you, the ink in those cartridges is not soy-based. It is oil-based. So it is actually worse for the environment to be printing only on one side with more dangerous chemicals than it is to print it. So it's less expensive and it's better for the environment to print publications. It's mind-boggling when people look at the research and still say what your client said, we're not going to do it.
And one thing I'd like to add to this particular topic is the issue of remote employees who are not in front of a computer all the time, who may not have ready access. Print can be a really valuable tool with that population of employees. Also, obviously, the leadership and how they, from all levels, how they go about communicating and how we arm them on a consistent and regular basis with the tools and resources they need to be really good at communicating to those remote employees. But the last thing that I would say that's really interesting about working with remote employees, because most of the organizations we work with have employees who are not sitting in front of a computer, and that is that leadership tends to assume they don't have any technical savvy, that they're not trained and they're not using technology the way that others are. And in fact, when we do research around this, we find that's not true. And those remote employees, they might be frontline miners working in the pit at a large gold mine, but when they get out of the pit, they're on smartphone and they're using all the same tools that the rest of us are.
Yeah, one other point I wanted to make, based, I think it was something Priya said, is that you don't see any insurance companies launching TikTok challenges for Medicare supplemental insurance. You have to know the demographic that is using the channels you want, no matter how anxious you are to, launch a TikTok challenge. And I think there are people who are, Angela, really swept up by the shiny new object and anxious to use it. But
the brilliance of some of these new channels is that they can't be used that one size fits all way. You just couldn't put a print ad onto TikTok and have it work or resonate or have anybody even look at it, right? So it's been very clever in terms of how some of these new channels are being created in order to meet a specific need for a specific audience.
So how much IT involvement really is necessary in an integrated communication system? Anybody have?
Well, I mean, they have to be involved at a fairly deep level. And I think the question is, what is their role? What role should they play? And really, in my experience, it needs to be a role of reacting to need and maintaining the resources, keeping the lights on. But should they be making all of these strategic decisions about how those tools and resources get used? No, they should not. Should they own the overall budget and, again, strategic decision making? No, they should not. But they need to be intimately involved in the process, because we rely on those resources to work effectively for all of that system to work well.
I read I think it was a Harvard Business Review article, and it was titled "The 9 IT Decisions That IT Should Not Be Allowed to Make." And
Okay, I want to read that.
at the crux of it was years ago, but at the crux of the article was these genuinely aren't IT decisions; they're business decisions. They just happen to focus on the use of IT systems. The business needs to be making the decision.
And there's a difference in the IT folks who are working inside our organizations are the ones who do keep the lights on. They're the binary thinkers. The ones who are developing are usually working for the platform companies who are creating some of these new tools and new things. So having those thinkers come in and make decisions that flip a switch on without even informing communication sometimes, i.e. Yammer and some of the Microsoft 365 tools, without managing processes and training and teaching people how to use them properly or why they even are there in the first place. It's really a yes-no answer for them. We need social media. Well, we already have Yammer. Let's flip it on and see what people do. I mean, that's what we've heard is happening in organizations, whereas it really needs to be a more thoughtful, purposeful process on why the tools we're using, what are they going to accomplish, and how are we going to measure success.
Which is distinct from experimenting, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we talked about this last month or the month before, that GE, back before they started having their meltdown, used to be great at experimenting with new social channels. I wish I could remember the name of this app. It was from one of the Twitter founders. And what you could do is take a picture of something, and then with your finger, you could draw a circle or an arrow, and then you would type a question, and it would go out to your followers on Twitter and their followers. It wouldn't be on Twitter. It just pulled in those networks. And people who had the answers would answer. It was kind of a cool little app. And GE, the day it launched, had an image of a latte. And in the foam in the top, they had the nuclear symbol embedded in that foam. And the question was, what scientist, living or dead, would you most like to have lunch with? And it generated like 200 responses. They ended up not using it, but the idea was, let's see what this can do. It wasn't part of any particular campaign, right? It's just, we have to play with this if we're going to decide that we're going to integrate it into our systems, which they ended up not doing.
Shel, if I can give you, and all of you, because I'm interested in hearing feedback on this, but I want to give you a really interesting example. One of my clients during the shutdown decided to reorganize corporate communication. They moved it.
Board, huh?
Yeah, they moved it under legal. So, or no, I'm sorry, finance. They moved it under finance. So corporate comm is now reporting through the CFO. My client is leaving corporate comm and moving into IT because she believes that IT and the CIO have a better strategic view of the overall communication system. So talk about experimentation. This is going to be very interesting. And it concerns me greatly because I don't believe that IT should be where everything is driven from. And I think in the long run, she'll be very unhappy that she's moved over there. So I'm just, it's an example of exactly what we're talking about here. I'm curious to hear from the rest of you what you think about that.
You know, I think we're onto something that's really important, and that's evidence-based practice. And, you know, as an academic, I always look for research to point to my students so that they can follow some good research and outcomes so that can influence their decision making. And there's not a whole lot in communications. I hear Shel and others talk about experimentation, but those are not done in any way where things are captured or it's scientifically valid. You know, I'm a great admirer of what Angela does in terms of her research and her knowledge of research methodologies. I find that rare. And then I also find that a lot of this is done on an internal basis and it's not something that's published. And what I always tell my students is, you know, what's the difference between a craft and a profession. I look at our colleagues, for example, in physical therapy, and all they learn is evidence-based practice. And now we see with COVID how important it is to look at scientific evidence. And we're not just going to say, well, we think that if we ingest this or wear this or don't touch this, that somehow we'll be prevented from contracting this disease. We keep going back and saying, where's the scientific evidence? And that's lacking in communications because it is so difficult to do experimental studies or other kinds of things that anybody thinks are valid or replicable. Yeah. But I think we can talk about doing all kinds of experimentation and trying this and doing that and coordinating this, but on what is the basis of our decision making? What I find is that somebody will say, well, my buddy over there did that and people really liked it. But that's kind of like saying, well, my knee hurt and my friend over there, decided to have 6 cups of coffee every day and it made it a lot better. So I guess that's what's wrong with my knee too. And I really think that I'm not sure where it should come from. I know it should come from academia. That's where a lot of this kind of research happens. But I also find that when people do research, there are people getting doctorates in communications and doing dissertations, but do any of us ever retrieve those or even know how to find them? No. We're not taught how to do that. But I do see that in other professions, in my college, for example, physical therapy went from what was more of a craft to now being a doctorate to have to be able to practice physical therapy. And one has to be able to perform research and consume research to be able to get a license to be a physical therapist. Will we ever get to that point in communications where we actually rely on research and have any research that we can come back to?
Well, that makes me think of 2 things. One, we do have to have a way for all of us practitioners who are doing research for clients to find a way to get that into the academic literature, because they're one-offs, but a lot of times research from academicians is too. But we just have to get permission from the client to talk about it, or else I guess we have to obscure the name of the client. But I think the second thing is that experimentation. It's actually easier to do for us communicators than we might think. And sometimes we've done it and we don't even realize we've done it. So the experimentation would be a very simple pilot. So if you think one approach is going to work better than another and some executive is arguing that another one will, you could try the 2 different approaches at 2 different similar locations or divisions and just do nothing at the others and then see what works better. Do nothing, do the executive's approach or your approach. But what I meant by that we may have already done it and not realize it is what I call an accidental pilot, because we develop these wonderful campaigns. They're integrated, they're strategic, and we launch them, but not everyone within the organization picks up on them. Managers don't do what they were asked to do in some places. And what we need to do is go back and see when we had different outcomes in different places, what was different about the communication input? The first time this happened to me, I was working in the HR communication industry, and this is when we were still introducing 401k plans. And we found that we didn't have a bell curve of how many people participated in the plans or how much money they put in. It was a U. We had half of their locations that had very high participation with high percentages of pay they put in, and the other half were very low. Few people joined them and put very little money in. And so we started making some phone calls to see why. And there was a difference. One element of the campaign was not used in some of those locations. The campaign at that point was print, yes, and some emails and videos to be shown in voluntary meetings. It was intended the meetings were voluntary for employees to decide to come or not. What happened is in some of these plants, the managers decided not to offer them, to volunteer them, because it's going to get in the way of production. They can read the brochure, they can join. Well, the problem is they didn't. We found that meeting with the video and the Q&A was what was critical in getting people to join. And it had an implication, because if you don't get enough people of lower pay levels to join these plans and put in enough money, then the executives who have already put money in have to get it back and pay taxes on it at the end of the year. Well, what was really brilliant with this client is they said, here's what we discovered. Now, if you don't want to get this money to be returned next year, you need to make sure there's meetings available for your employees during our next campaign. It's like, yes, look at the outcomes you had. Where did it work? Where did it not? You probably have an experiment that you already conducted unintentionally.
Oh, those were the days, highly compensated and not highly compensated. Do want to remind those who are watching that you've got about 9.5 minutes left where you can ask a question using the chat function on YouTube or the COF57 hashtag on Twitter. I'm watching, ready to answer your questions. So one of the questions that came up is around shared leadership. It seems that if you've got the PR department and the marketing department and internal communications and, for all we know, even government relations would be involved in something like this. Is there training required to get people to work in this kind of environment? Understanding that somebody's going to be the project lead, you still have multiple department heads who are engaged in the same project and need to figure out how to work together.
Some of that might be culturally driven, right? There are companies that just naturally understand that there is collaboration in the organization. This is what it looks like. This is what success looks like. And I've benefited from working in teams like that, and then not benefited from working with other groups that really struggle with even talking to each other and being in the same room with one another. So I think that it really focusing on the outcomes and then measuring success, as Angela would say, and ensuring that we're recognizing that really great behavior really is kind of a cycle that needs to happen in organizations in order to drive that collaborative behavior. And I think there's a lot to be said. I mean, I'm not sure about everybody else around here, but some of my best projects, some of the greatest things that I've ever done were always a team effort. And it was really about the power of the collective, not me being by myself out in front. And those are the things that I really hold dear. And when you experience that, I think it's kind of a self-prophecy. You want to be part of that more and more.
It takes that facilitation skill that Stacy was talking about.
I was reading an interview with, of all people, John Mayer, the singer, who has a history of appearing in tabloids and being kind of a jerk.
A good Canadian boy. What is that?
Jerk is a little mild, Shel.
Pardon?
Jerk is a little mild.
Yeah, it is a little mild, and he acknowledges it. What happened was he got hooked up with a band. I won't go into the details, but he is now just one of the players in the band. He's not the leader of the band, and he says it has been a humbling and maturing experience to not be the guy in charge, to be contributing equally with all of the various components, and he's able to look back at his behavior before and say, wow, I was a jerk. Do you think it's a valuable experience for communicators to do this, to get involved on a team of other communicators and maybe legal and have this experience?
I think it's huge. I think it's the most important role that we play. Is to, again, I come back to the facilitation. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but it is the most important thing that we can benefit and value that we can give to the organization is to help bring those people together, help them learn how to work together, and help all of the best ideas come out and the best decision making get made as well. Yeah.
We certainly have had lots of years or decades of experience of being the support people, not the leaders. So I think we understand what that role can be and how to make sure those voices are all heard.
Oh, talk about go ahead, Diane.
I wonder how the dynamics change when some of these functions are primarily outsourced rather than their internal teams. I see a trend, especially in hiring of young people, because I'm tapped into where our young graduates are going. And especially for some of the newer things like social media, I find that it's being done on a contract or freelance basis. Things are being farmed out to various kinds of agencies. And I think there's one challenge to bring a group of people together who have an ongoing relationship with an organization. And I think it's another level of challenge to bring in people who are not part of that and in fact are going to be remote. And what are the challenges and rewards and what are the dynamics there in terms of playing nicely in the same sandbox? What I hear reports of is a lot of people feeling like they are hanging on for their jobs, right? Because you have these young employees, especially who are going out and being contracted as freelancers to manage some kind of social channel or whatever. And they're fighting for that job. They're fighting for that contract. And it's very difficult for them to know how to play together with these other members of teams who are also coming and going and don't have the luxury of at least some perceived continuation of employment or some ability to get together and maybe even meet in person. So I wonder if any of you are experiencing or hearing about additional challenges.
I've been part of a project where we were working with the organization to put together a measurement dashboard for them, internal and external. And on the employee communication side, the person in that role was not the regular person who was out on maternity leave. It was an outside consultant who was working full-time in that role. But that person continued to work like a consultant rather than a team player. So we'd have a meeting, all these people would agree on something, and then they just had to put finishing touches on it, and she would rewrite the whole thing so it matched what she wanted the whole thing to look like. So she wasn't playing like a team player in that department. She thought she should have been leading that whole project and just was continually disruptive at every step.
We frequently come into an organization as one of several different, contract or consulting members coming into the team. And so that's something that we've just had the opportunity to do for a long time now. Myself in particular, I've worked on a lot of teams where I'm one of maybe a half a dozen different consultants from different places. And we're also working with the client team, and those folks maybe come from 10 different departments. In fact, I've had clients tell me that I probably know more people in the organization than they do because of all the interactions that we tend to have. But something I want to follow up on what Diane said before I forget about the issue of outsourcing. So we were in a really interesting situation with a client that outsourced their IT function. And when that happened, so the whole IT function, the employees were the same because it was IBM that they outsourced to, and IBM simply hired all the employees. So they were sitting in the same at the same desk, working with the same people. Corporate Communications decided to no longer support the communication needs of the IT function because they weren't employees. And so the CIO hired me and my team to provide the communication for them. And after about 2 or 3 years of very successful implementation, Corporate Communications woke up and said, oh, well, we can't let them make us look bad. So we're going to have to take that on. And they did. They stepped in and we were shown the door, and Corporate Com took it over. And from what I understand, it did not go well. But it was a really interesting example of what happens sometimes when that outsourcing takes place on a large scale.
We are out of time, unfortunately. Wow. We are about 45 seconds from the top of the hour. I do want to let everyone know what's happening next month, and I don't have the date in front of me. If somebody can pull up what the third Thursday of June is. Our topic is communicating the workplace to the marketplace by integrating internal and external communication. Angela and Priya, you'll both be back next month for that one. You'll be joining Alice Brink and Jim Schaffer for a great conversation, and that will be on June
18th.
June 18th. Thank you. I also want to thank all of you for being here today. And of course, Anna Willie for all the behind the scenes work.
Thank you,
and,
Anna.
Those of you who are watching, thanks a lot. And see you next month.
Bye, everybody.